Morris Chang was born in 1931 in Ningbo, a port city that had once been a hinge between China and the wider world. The dynasty that built its canals was long gone, the republic that replaced it already coming apart. The century was young and exhausted. Across the coast, factories that had once supplied the British now stood half idle, their machines imported, their operators uncertain what they were supposed to build. Chang's father was an educated man in a collapsing system. He worked for the railway ministry, a bureaucrat of the new kind, literate in Confucian order, fluent in modern ambition. He believed China's decay was not moral but mechanical. "We have too many poets," he told his son, "and too few engineers." The words were not a complaint, but a program. They described the logic of survival in a world ruled by machines. When Japan invaded in 1937, that logic was tested. The Changs fled first to Hong Kong, then back to Shanghai, and finally westward to the provisional capital of Chongqing, a journey of thousands of miles through the anatomy of a broken country. Chang was 6. He remembered trains that stopped for days, bridges rebuilt under air raids, cities that smelled of kerosene and fear. School moved with the front lines. He studied arithmetic by candlelight, memorized English words from scraps of books, and learned to calculate while the ground shook. War was his first teacher. It taught him that order could be destroyed and rebuilt on the same day. The engineers who repaired bridges by dawn after seeing them bombed by dusk became his first heroes. They worked without glory, without sleep, driven only by the conviction that measurement and patience could oppose chaos. That conviction would become the structure of his mind. When the Japanese surrendered in 1945, China's victory felt hollow. The Civil War resumed almost immediately, nationalists and communists fighting over a nation already in ruins. Inflation devoured wages, factories ran without raw materials. The dream of modernity seemed to evaporate in the smoke of its own ambition. In that interlude of collapse, Chang finished high school. He was good at math, good enough to attract teachers who saw in him a future that China could no longer provide. In 1948, he won a rare opportunity: admission to Harvard. His father sold what was left of the family's possessions to pay for the voyage. When he boarded the ship for America, he was 17, thin, precise in manner, already old in habit. The Civil War raged behind him. The communists would seize power before his first year of college ended. He would never live in China again. The America he entered was intoxicated by confidence. The Second World War had proved that production was destiny. The country had built tanks, bombers, and ships at a rate the world had never seen. Now it was building suburbs and satellites. Science had won the war and was now tasked with winning the peace. In this new empire, the engineer was king. Harvard, though, was still an old world of rhetoric and restraint. The young Chinese student found himself surrounded by the future administrators of America, not its builders. He studied physics and mathematics, but felt the institution's detachment from matter. "They talked about the beauty of ideas," he recalled later, "but I wanted to know how things worked." After a year, he transferred across the Charles River to MIT, trading Latin for circuitry. MIT in the early 1950s was the beating heart of the new technocracy. Its laboratories were filled with the residue of war: radar sets, vacuum tubes, early computers. Professors who had designed bombing systems now taught feedback control. The Cold War had begun, and the line between research and defense blurred into one long grant proposal. For the first time, Chang felt that precision was not just a virtue, but a patriotic duty. He studied electrical engineering and mathematics. He found comfort in their absolutes. He wasn't a prodigy, not the kind of student who dazzled in seminars, but he was tireless. He treated every assignment as an experiment in consistency. When he failed his doctoral qualifying exams twice, he recorded every mistake in a notebook, analyzing them like measurement errors. "Failure," he would later say, "is only data." He left MIT without a PhD, but with the knowledge that endurance is a form of intelligence. His first job was at Sylvania Semiconductor in Massachusetts, one of the early companies racing to turn the transistor from laboratory curiosity into commercial product. The work was dull to most engineers and sacred to him. It consisted of controlling the invisible, refining the diffusion of impurities through germanium wafers, balancing temperature gradients within a few degrees, measuring resistances that drifted by fractions. Every error had a reason. and finding it was an act of respect toward the material world. At Sylvania, he discovered his life's constant: yield. Yield was the ratio of success to attempt, the percentage of transistors that actually worked. Most engineers treated it as accounting. He treated it as truth. A process with poor yield was a liar. A process with good yield had learned to speak the same language as physics. He began to see in yield a kind of morality, honesty expressed numerically. By 1958, he had established a reputation for precision beyond his years. Texas Instruments called, Dallas was no Cambridge. It was heat, bravado, and belief. A city of oilmen turned technologists led by Patrick Haggerty, who spoke of the transistor the way preachers spoke of salvation. TI had ambitions no one else dared to voice, to replace every vacuum tube in every circuit on Earth. It had contracts with IBM and the US military, the two great patrons of post-war technology. What it didn't have was reliability. When Chang arrived, the yields were disastrous. Some runs produced 0 working transistors. The engineers blamed materials, the managers blamed luck. Chang blamed the process. He treated the factory as a living system with vital signs to be recorded and diagnosed. He mapped every variable: furnace temperatures, gas purity, humidity, even the rhythm of shift changes. He found hidden inconsistencies in diffusion times and realigned them with the precision of a surgeon. Within months, the numbers transformed. Yields rose from nothing to more than 25%. The company's losses turned into profits. Chang spent that night pacing, unable to sleep. For the first time, he said later, I felt I had changed reality through understanding. The success made him indispensable. He became known as the engineer who could make things work. He rose through the ranks, not through charm, but through results. His colleagues learned to read his silence. If he didn't speak, it meant the data wasn't ready. He kept his authority quiet, like a calibrated instrument. In Dallas, he encountered a culture of improvisation, what Americans called ingenuity, and began to see both its brilliance and its limits. Ingenuity could win wars, it could not sustain peace. He respected his peers' creativity but distrusted their impatience. They celebrated invention, he valued refinement. When others bragged about how quickly they could fix a problem, he asked how they would prevent it from recurring. To him, that was the difference between art and engineering. Texas Instruments in the late 1950s was expanding into integrated circuits, combining multiple transistors on a single silicon chip. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of wiring discrete components, one could etch entire logic systems onto a flat surface. The complexity thrilled Chang. It was the first time he had seen human thought made literal, logic embedded in matter. He began to view the transistor not as a product, but as a new alphabet. You could write with it, he said, if you learned the grammar. He stayed late in the labs, studying process data, trying to anticipate failures before they appeared. He had developed an instinct for measurement, an ability to sense when a number was about to go wrong. Colleagues joked that he had a sixth sense for yield. In truth, he had simply learned to listen to the machine the way musicians listen to pitch. By the end of the decade, he was managing his own teams. His reputation for quiet control preceded him. He didn't shout, didn't flatter, didn't pretend to genius. He believed excellence was cumulative, thousands of small accuracies layered into inevitability. When asked years later what defined a great engineer, he said, the ability to do it the same way twice. He was still in his 20s, already a senior figure in one of America's most ambitious companies, a man whose life had traversed continents and ideologies, but whose loyalties remained to numbers. The refugee child from a collapsing empire had become the custodian of precision in the empire of abundance. In the years ahead, Texas Instruments would rise to global power, and Chang would rise with it, but that was still to come. For now, he was exactly where his childhood had prepared him to be, in a factory, among machines, measuring the distance between chaos and control, and proving, line by line, that order was something you could make. When Morris Chang arrived in Dallas in 1958, the city seemed to shimmer with optimism. Oil money had built its towers, but electricity, the kind that hummed inside laboratories and transistors, gave it confidence. Texas Instruments was still a young company with a brash founder, Patrick Haggerty, who spoke of electronics the way prospectors once spoke of gold. The transistor had escaped the lab, and Haggerty meant to make it cheap enough, reliable enough, and ubiquitous enough to define a civilization. He hired Chang because he had heard about a quiet engineer in Massachusetts who treated numbers like commandments. TI's transistor yields were abysmal. The devices worked in prototypes but failed in production. Each batch produced mostly waste. Haggerty, impatient, gave Chang the problem as if handing him an unsolved equation. Chang responded not with slogans or blame, but with the habits of a lifetime. He studied the line the way a doctor studies a patient, noting every temperature drift, every impurity in the germanium, the exact moment workers replaced one furnace with another. He charted variables until the pattern emerged. The errors weren't mysteries, they were measurements waiting to be recognized. He adjusted the diffusion cycles, tightened the tolerances, and watched the numbers climb. Within months, yields rose from 0 to nearly 30%. A process that had mocked the company's ambitions now obeyed them. That night, he later said, he couldn't sleep. It was the first time he had felt the weight of transformation, the moment when understanding replaces chance. He had turned confusion into method, and in doing so, found the vocabulary that would define his life. Yield was not profit, it was truth expressed as percentage. Haggerty recognized talent that didn't advertise itself. He promoted Chang through the manufacturing hierarchy until his authority extended across TY's transistor operations. The company's culture suited him in part, pragmatic, direct, impatient with theory. But he also saw its volatility. Texans believed problems could be forced into submission. Chang believed they had to be understood into coherence. He became a translator between those tempers, teaching production managers to think statistically, teaching researchers to respect the people who made their designs real. The 1960s rewarded such mediation. The Cold War had transformed semiconductors into instruments of power. Every missile guidance system, every satellite, every mainframe computer required transistors. The federal government poured billions into the companies that could deliver, and TI became one of the Pentagon's favorites. Its plants expanded across Texas and California. Its payroll tripled. Its optimism hardened into identity. In that atmosphere, an engineer like Chang was gold, calm amid ambition, fluent in both circuitry and management. He ran lines that supplied IBM, RCA, and the new generation of aerospace firms. He learned to manage across cultures of mind, physicists, chemists, accountants, machinists. Still, he felt a gap in his own knowledge. He could see that the problems of manufacturing weren't just technical, they were statistical. Each step in fabrication, diffusion, oxidation, metallization, was governed by distributions, not absolutes. To control them required more than intuition. In 1961, TI offered to fund his doctoral studies. He chose Stanford, partly because it was new and restless, partly because California smelled like the future. Stanford was changing the world even as it taught it. Fairchild Semiconductor had just spun off the engineers who would later found Intel. Professors moved between lecture halls and startups with the ease of commuters. The transistor was shrinking, and with it, the distance between imagination and production. Chang arrived older than most of his classmates, disciplined where they were improvisational. He admired their creativity but trusted only measurement. His research on process variation and yield statistics gave mathematical form to everything he had sensed by instinct. He studied how impurities drifted through silicon, how temperature gradients warped probability, how randomness could be predicted if recorded honestly enough. In 2.5 years, he finished the doctorate that others took 5 to complete. When he returned to Dallas, he carried not only a diploma, but a new certainty that order could be designed. The TI he rejoined was wealthier and more complex than the one he had left. The company was now building integrated circuits, whole logical systems etched onto a single chip, and selling them to both defense contractors and consumer electronics firms. Chang was assigned to manage production of the new devices where errors multiplied exponentially. A single speck of dust could ruin a wafer. A single misaligned mask could ruin hundreds. He instituted statistical controls so strict that colleagues called them Chang's commandments. To him, they were simply acknowledgments of physics. Under his supervision, yields climbed again. The fabs that followed his methods became the company's most profitable divisions. But even as he succeeded, he began to see the shadow of success: bureaucracy. Meetings lengthened, memos multiplied, and the language of finance crept into engineering. The same executives who had once prowled the factory floor now flew to conferences to announce visions. Chang understood that this was the natural life cycle of institutions, energy condensing into structure, yet he couldn't accept it as progress. For him, innovation without discipline was vanity, and discipline without purpose was death. When TI expanded to Japan in the mid-1960s, he was sent to help establish the company's first major Asian plant. It was his first return to the East since childhood. Japan was recovering from its own wartime devastation, rebuilding with an intensity that astonished him. The engineers there treated process as ritual. Equipment was cleaned with the same respect soldiers once gave swords. Meetings began exactly on time. Silence was not awkward but considered. The term Kaizen, continuous improvement, described not a program but a worldview. For Chang, it felt familiar. It was the logic of the bridge builders he had watched in Chongqing: repair, refine, repeat. He absorbed everything he could, convinced that precision was cultural before it was technical. The TI-Japan collaboration succeeded beyond expectation. Within a few years, the plant's yields surpassed its American counterparts. Chang returned to Dallas with data that proved what he had suspected. Excellence could be systematized if the system respected patience. Yet he also sensed that the American industrial temperament was changing. Where the Japanese spoke of process, the Americans spoke of product. The factory floor, once the heart of the enterprise, was becoming peripheral to the myth of innovation. Chang kept quiet, but took notes. The 1970s brought both triumph and unease. TI launched the world's first handheld calculator and pioneered digital watches. The integrated circuit was no longer a curiosity. It was civilization's grammar, but success had side effects. The company grew so fast that it began to lose memory of why it existed. Middle managers replaced craftsmen. Creativity became a line item. Chang, now a senior vice president, traveled constantly between plants in the United States, Japan, and Europe. His notebooks thickened with numbers, but his conviction began to shift from faith in the corporation to faith in the craft itself. He still loved the rhythm of production, the sound of vacuum pumps, the fluorescence of clean rooms, but he could feel the drift of priorities. Engineering was no longer the unquestioned center of power. Finance was ascendant. He described the transformation without bitterness, almost scientifically. When a company becomes large, measurement moves from physics to accounting. He stayed because the work still mattered, and because he believed the discipline he had built could survive fashion. Yet he knew something fundamental had changed. The America that had trained him, the Republic of Engineers, was slowly becoming a republic of managers. He responded by turning inward to the one constant that never betrayed him: process. Every morning he reviewed yield charts as if reading scripture. Every evening he walked the production lines, speaking with technicians whose hands knew more than any report could tell him. He wrote private notes about integrity in manufacturing, that the true test of character was how a company behaved when no one was measuring. They were fragments of philosophy, but they kept him steady. By the mid-1970s, Chang had become the embodiment of disciplined modernity, the immigrant who understood both America's hunger and Asia's patience, the engineer who could make the numbers sing. He had risen from war refugee to one of the highest technical ranks in an empire of silicon. Yet beneath the achievement lay an unease he couldn't ignore, the sense that progress had started to mistake speed for virtue. He still believed in perfection, but he was beginning to wonder whether his adopted country did. That question would follow him quietly for the next decade. It would lead him eventually to a place where the memory of bridges rebuilt under fire would meet the future of light etched into silicon. But in the 1970s, he was still in motion, an engineer at the height of his powers, standing at the intersection of two centuries, one that had learned to dream through science, and another that was beginning to forget the cost of order. When Chiang Kai-shek's defeated army crossed the Taiwan Strait in 1949, it brought with it 2 million people, a treasury emptied of silver, and a government still claiming to be China. The island that received them had been a Japanese colony for half a century. Its railways and sugar mills were efficient, its farmers literate, but its politics provincial. Under martial law, the new Republic of China rebuilt itself as a fortress state, half military outpost, half laboratory. Survival came first, democracy later. The Americans, fearing another domino, supplied cash, weapons, and advisors. In return, Taiwan became a showcase for the capitalist version of modernization. The government's technocrats, men like K.T. Lee, educated at Cambridge and Michigan, saw industry as salvation. They introduced land reform, dismantling feudal holdings and creating a class of small farmers who would become the island's first consumers. Then they built an export machine, moving from textiles to plastics to electronics. By the 1970s, the world knew the label "Made in Taiwan." Few knew what it cost. Wages were low, hours long, politics repressed, but competence was spreading like literacy. The island's engineers, educated abroad and returning with new vocabularies, began to imagine factories not as sweatshops, but as systems of learning. When martial law finally lifted, they would inherit a nation already trained in precision. By then, halfway around the world, Morris Chang was nearing the top of another system that had forgotten its hunger. Texas Instruments had become an empire of silicon, its calculators on every desk, its chips in every missile, but its internal rhythm had slowed. The company's culture had evolved from invention to administration, and Chang, now in his 50s, found himself managing people who spoke the language of markets more fluently than that of materials. He still carried notebooks filled with yield data. They carried projections. He had once been the young engineer who fixed the impossible. Now he was the veteran executive reminding others why the possible mattered. The shift was subtle at first. Meetings lengthened. Spreadsheets replaced schematics. Where he once argued about diffusion temperatures, he now listened to debates about shareholder value. The logic of engineering, where truth is empirical and mistakes are measured, had given way to the logic of finance, where truth is negotiated. Chang remained outwardly calm, but the change unsettled him. The company that had taught him to worship process was beginning to pray to quarterly returns. In 1983, the boardroom drama became personal. Patrick Haggerty had retired years earlier, and a new generation of executives was ready to anoint its own. Chang, senior vice president for semiconductors, expected nothing but respect and perhaps, quietly, the presidency. He had given the company 25 years, turned factories into laboratories, and trained a generation of engineers who now ran its most profitable divisions. When the board chose someone younger and flashier, a marketing executive skilled in investor briefings, Chang understood immediately. They wanted charisma, he said later. I had competence. The announcement was polite, the wound exact. His title remained impressive, his influence diminished. Colleagues called it being put out to pasture. In his own notes, he described it as a misalignment of values. What hurt was not the lost promotion, but the confirmation that the American industrial empire he had served was losing its faith in the discipline that built it. He could fix a process, but not a culture. That autumn, he cleaned his office with the same method he had once used to clean a fabrication line, slowly, deliberately, recording what mattered. He resigned without protest, taking with him a lifetime of notebooks and an unshakable conviction that precision, once abandoned, is hard to recover. He was 52, too old to start over, too young to stop working. Friends advised consulting, academia, retirement. He chose patience. When you have built your life on iteration, he told a friend, you wait for the next cycle. History obliged. Across the Pacific, Taiwan's miracle was reaching its ceiling. The island had mastered assembly, but not invention. Its export factories were efficient, its engineers disciplined, but the profits flowed to Japan and America. K.T. Lee, now Minister of Economic Affairs, believed the solution was technology, real technology, the kind that demands faith in process. He created the Industrial Technology Research Institute, or ITRI, as a state laboratory for importing knowledge and domesticating it. He sent emissaries abroad to find Chinese engineers who had learned the secrets of modern industry and might be persuaded to bring them home. They found Chang in 1984, consulting quietly and bored. At first, he dismissed the idea. Taiwan was still under martial law. He had been an American citizen for decades, but Lee was persuasive. You know how to build systems, he said. We are trying to build a country. The words struck him. He had spent a lifetime perfecting processes inside corporations that treated nations as abstractions. The chance to apply that knowledge to an actual nation, one that still believed in the moral weight of competence, was tempting. He agreed to visit. What he saw surprised him. Taiwan was not the poor cousin of Asia he remembered from headlines. Its roads were crowded with scooters and optimism, its factories filled with young engineers who reminded him of himself in his 20s, serious, practical, hungry. Itri's laboratories were chaotic but alive. The equipment was old, the documentation sparse, but the energy unmistakable. They had the talent, he said later. They lacked only order. He accepted the offer to lead the institute. It was not a glamorous position. It was something closer to stewardship. He set about imposing discipline. He introduced the same statistical control systems he had developed at TI, organized data collection, demanded punctuality, and forbade improvisation without measurement. At first, the younger engineers bristled. They had grown up under an authoritarian government and expected freedom in science. Chang reminded them that process was a different kind of freedom, the freedom from randomness. Slowly, they adapted. Yields improved. Morale followed. The political air was changing too. Martial law would end in 1987, but the spirit of transition was already visible. The generals still ruled, yet the technocrats were writing the real future. They saw in Chang a figure who embodied what Taiwan wanted to become: worldly, disciplined, apolitical, incorruptible. He, in turn, saw in them a society still capable of collective purpose. The contrast with America's corporate exhaustion was impossible to miss. At ITRI, he began to think beyond the laboratory. The global semiconductor industry was entering a new phase. The cost of fabrication plants was exploding. Only a few giants, Intel, IBM, NEC, could afford to build at the cutting edge. Smaller design companies were trapped by capital requirements. Chang watched the numbers with the same fascination he once reserved for yields. The equation didn't balance. The world, he wrote in his notes, needs a foundry. He meant it literally, a factory that would manufacture chips for anyone, without owning designs or competing with clients. It was a radical inversion of the industry's hierarchy, as if a publishing house promised to print every author but write no books. Yet the logic was pure engineering. Specialization reduces waste. Separation of function increases clarity. In this vision, design and manufacturing could evolve independently, each pushing the other forward. He tested the idea on his engineers. They were intrigued but cautious. No one had ever done it. The great companies guarded their fabs like fortresses. Their processes were trade secrets. But Chang was accustomed to disbelief. He began drafting a plan, funding structure, capacity projections, potential clients, even the architecture of the first plant. He needed partners who understood both the physics and the politics. Taiwan's government would have to provide capital. Foreign investors would have to lend credibility and access to equipment. Philips Electronics in the Netherlands, already collaborating with ITRI, seemed ideal. In late 1986, he flew to Europe to negotiate. The meetings were pragmatic, not grand. The Dutch executives wanted assurances about management and intellectual property control. Chang promised transparency, accountability, and the one commodity he could guarantee: competence. Philips agreed to take a minority stake. The Taiwanese government would supply the rest. The company would be called the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. In the spring of 1987, as the first clean room rose in Hsinchu Science Park, Chang watched construction crews lay the foundations and felt something he hadn't felt in decades: the stillness before order. He was no longer the young man fixing furnaces in Dallas, nor the executive drifting through meetings. He was back at the beginning, measuring possibility against precision. The island around him buzzed with scooters and humidity. Inside the new building, engineers installed filtration systems with surgical care. For the first time, he felt the war's lessons returning to relevance. That stability must be rebuilt every day, and that perfection begins with the refusal to accept chaos as natural. The lights came on in the fab that summer. Taiwan's engineers in white suits moved like monks between machines, checking gauges, calibrating lasers. The first wafers would take months to produce, the first clients even longer to persuade. But the system existed, ready to learn, to repeat, to improve. Outside, the island's democracy was about to be born. Inside, a new kind of industry was taking its first breath. When the first wafers rolled off the line in 1987, no one outside Hsinchu Science Park noticed. The global semiconductor press covered product launches in California and mergers in Tokyo. A factory on a humid island was not news. Inside the plant, however, the atmosphere bordered on religious. The rooms were silent except for the low hiss of filtered air. Engineers in pale green suits moved between machines, writing numbers on clipboards. Chang visited daily, walking slowly through the long corridors, listening for irregular sounds, the hum of pumps, the click of valves, as if the building were alive. He had spent his life in factories, but this one was different. It was not an arm of a corporation. It was an idea made tangible, a foundry for everyone and no one. The first months were difficult. The imported equipment from Philips arrived late, and the training materials were written for Dutch engineers, not Mandarin-speaking graduates. Some batches failed entirely. Dust intrusion ruined a week's production. Chang refused to blame. He collected the data, charted the variables, and reminded his staff that perfection begins as repetition. Every mistake, he told them, is a measurement. Slowly, the numbers improved. By the end of the year, the defect rate had fallen below expectations. Yield, the old word that had followed him since Sylvania, was climbing. Convincing customers was harder. The giants of the industry, IBM, Motorola, Intel, saw no need for an outsider. They built their own chips and considered manufacturing a form of sovereignty. Chang aimed lower, courting small American design houses that could not afford their own fabs. LSI Logic became the first to trust him, sending a handful of prototype designs. Then came AMD, struggling with capacity limits. The engineers in California were skeptical of an island they could barely locate on a map, but the economics were irresistible. TSMC would take their designs, fabricate the chips, and guarantee confidentiality. No leaks, no competition, no surprises. That guarantee became the company's creed. Chang enforced it not through secrecy, but through culture. Every engineer, from trainee to executive, signed the same non-disclosure agreement. Visitors were logged, documents watermarked, computer access compartmentalized. Yet he discouraged paranoia. Trust, he said, is our product. Clients began to notice. Their prototypes arrived on schedule, within specification, unannounced. Word spread through Silicon Valley that the factory in Taiwan delivered exactly what it promised, and nothing else. Behind the scenes, Chang balanced a precarious triangle of interests. The Taiwanese government wanted quick results and global recognition. Philips wanted predictable returns. His engineers wanted proof that their discipline mattered. He gave each what it needed in sequence. To ministers, he spoke of national independence through technology. To Philips executives, he spoke of quality metrics and market share. To his staff, he spoke of numbers. A yield chart, he said, is not politics. Within 2 years, TSMC was profitable. The timing was perfect. The world was entering the age of design specialization. American startups like Qualcomm and Broadcom were designing chips for wireless communication and networking, but could not afford billion-dollar fabs. Japan's giants were constrained by hierarchy. Europe's by bureaucracy. The foundry in Taiwan offered a new model of cooperation. Designers could focus on imagination. Manufacturers could focus on accuracy. Creativity and discipline, separated at birth, were reunited through contract. Chang saw more than profit in the arrangement. He saw a moral structure. Each client relationship was a test of honesty. Specifications stated clearly, schedules met precisely, mistakes admitted immediately. The system rewarded integrity in a way markets rarely did. Within the company, he banned marketing slogans and corporate boasting. The brand would be its consistency. Engineers who suggested advertising campaigns were reminded that the best reputation was invisibility. If we are doing our job, he said, no one should notice us. The policy worked. By 1990, TSMC's client list read like the index of the coming digital era. American startups shipped their designs across the Pacific and received working chips weeks later. Japanese firms subcontracted overflow production to meet demand. European telecom companies tested prototypes in Hsinchu before mass production elsewhere. The fab became an international commons, the neutral ground of computation. The island's economy shifted almost overnight from labor-intensive assembly to high-precision manufacturing. Made in Taiwan began to mean something different. Not cheap imitation, but reliable perfection. Inside the fabs, Chang cultivated a culture that mixed Confucian restraint with Silicon Valley tempo. Workdays were long, meetings short. Engineers were encouraged to speak through data, not opinion. He replaced motivational posters with process diagrams and insisted that even managers learn to read yield charts. Performance evaluations were numerical, promotions meritocratic. In a society still half-hierarchical, this was revolutionary. "We are not a family," he told his executives. "We are a system." The phrase shocked them at first, then liberated them. A system, after all, could be improved. Taiwan itself was changing. Martial law ended in 1987, the same year TSMC was founded. Political parties formed, newspapers proliferated, students marched. The island was learning democracy as its factories learned process control. Both experiments relied on transparency and discipline. Chang avoided politics publicly, but privately saw the parallel. "Democracy," he once told a reporter, "is a form of statistical control. You measure mistakes and correct them." The line sounded ironic coming from an engineer, but it captured Taiwan's moment: precision as survival. In those early years, TSMC's connection to Philips remained crucial. The Dutch partner provided equipment and access to Western markets. Its European engineers trained local staff in advanced photolithography. The collaboration also introduced Chang to another company whose name would later become inseparable from TSMC's, ASML. At the time, ASML was a struggling subsidiary of Philips, building lithography machines that used light to etch microscopic patterns onto silicon. Chang recognized its potential immediately. He arranged joint testing, sharing process data that would help refine both the machines and his own yields. It was the beginning of a partnership that would, decades later, define the limits of physics. The first fab was small, less than 100,000 square feet, but it embodied the future. Its walls were triple sealed, its air filtered 1,000 times cleaner than a hospital's. A single wafer contained more transistors than there were people on the island. For young Taiwanese engineers, it was not just a job, but initiation into a global fraternity of precision. Many of them came from farming families. They understood patience, repetition, and weather. Chang often said that made them perfect for manufacturing. "Farming and fabrication," he joked, "are both acts of faith in process." By 1992, TSMC was expanding. A second fab rose beside the first, and a third was planned before the second was complete. The company's revenue doubled every 2 years. Its workforce grew into the tens of thousands. The island's government celebrated it as proof that technology could substitute for territory. Taiwan could not match China's population or America's military, but it could build the world's most perfect machines. The silicon shield, as journalists would later call it, was already forming, though no one yet used the phrase. Chang resisted triumphalism. He reminded his board that the company's advantage was fragile. A single lapse in trust, a single compromised design, could destroy it. He created internal auditing teams whose only task was to look for weakness. He instituted a culture of redundancy: 2 power grids for every fab, duplicate servers for every database, backup teams for every critical process. His employees sometimes complained that he worried too much. He replied that worry was the engineer's form of love. The success transformed Taiwan's self-image. Students who once dreamed of emigrating to America now applied to engineering programs at National Chongqing University in Hsinchu, hoping to join TSMC. The company's graduates populated the island's new startups, designing chips for consumer electronics and telecommunications. Foreign delegations arrived to study how a small, densely populated island had built the cleanest factories on Earth. The answer, Chang liked to say, was simple: we respect dust. It was a joke that doubled as a worldview. By the mid-1990s, TSMC had outgrown its partners. Philips reduced its stake, content to remain an ally. The Taiwanese government gradually privatized its share. The company entered global markets on its own, listing shares in Taipei and New York. Its customers now included not only startups but giants: Motorola, Texas Instruments, and even IBM. The irony amused Chang, his former employer sending designs to be manufactured by the engineer it had once deemed expendable. Asked how it felt, he only smiled. "Processes remember," he said. "People forget." Each new generation of chips demanded smaller features, cleaner environments, and tighter collaboration with equipment suppliers. ASML's photolithography machines became the bottleneck of progress. Chang invested heavily in joint research, funding experimental light sources and resists that would later make extreme ultraviolet lithography possible. He believed that the future of semiconductors depended on cooperation between toolmakers and manufacturers, a belief that turned out to be prophetic. Through it all, his management style remained consistent. He avoided grand speeches, preferring short briefings focused on data. He discouraged personal heroics. Engineers who rescued failing projects were praised in private, but warned that heroism meant the system had failed. His favorite compliment was silence, a process so stable it produced nothing to discuss. The discipline extended to himself. He arrived early, left late, and refused chauffeur or entourage. He lived modestly in Hsinchu, surrounded by books and the hum of distant fabs. Looking back decades later, many of his engineers would describe those years as a golden age, the time when Taiwan learned to build at the limits of matter and to believe that precision could be moral. The island's democracy matured alongside its technology. Elections replaced decrees, algorithms replaced guesswork. Chang rarely commented on politics, but his influence was everywhere. The habits he had taught, measurement, accountability, quiet pride, bled into civic life. A society that had once survived through obedience was learning to survive through competence. By the late 1990s, TSMC was the world's largest dedicated foundry. Its customers spanned continents, its fabs produced millions of chips per week, and its engineers were already planning the next generation of process nodes. The company had achieved something no government or ideology had managed. It had made cooperation between rivals profitable. The clean rooms of Hsinchu had become the world's most neutral territory. For Chang, the satisfaction was personal, but not sentimental. He saw in the company's success a vindication of his earliest lessons. The boy who had watched bridges rebuilt under bombs had proved that endurance could be designed. The refugee who had fled a collapsing empire had built a factory that turned repetition into art, yet he still resisted myth. "We did not invent perfection," he said in an interview. "We just refused to stop improving." Outside, the island glowed with light. Factories, offices, and apartment towers stretching from Taipei to Kaohsiung. From the air, the science park looked like a constellation, each fab a star burning white against the tropical dark. Inside, under filtered air, the next batch of wafers was already moving through the line, being measured, etched, polished, tested. The process never slept. Neither did history. By the end of the 1990s, TSMC had become the quiet heart of the digital economy. The company manufactured chips for hundreds of customers, yet its name appeared on none of them. The world's most advanced logic was being born anonymously in the clean rooms of Hsinchu. Its profits were steady, its reputation unmatched, and its founder, Morris Chang, had turned 70. He had achieved what most engineers never do. He had built a company whose culture was more precise than its machines. The world around him was accelerating. The internet was transforming communication. Mobile phones were shrinking from bricks to pocket devices, and Moore's Law, the doubling of transistor density every 18 months, had become the rhythm of civilization. But Moore's Law was not a law. It was a pact between engineers and nature, enforced by those who could keep shrinking the features of silicon without losing yield. TSMC's fabs had become the places where that pact was renewed. Chang's relationship with ASML deepened in these years. The Dutch firm, once a struggling offshoot of Philips, had become the world's leading maker of lithography machines, the equipment that projected patterns of light onto wafers to create the circuitry of microchips. Without ASML's lenses, no new generation of chips could be printed. Without TSMC's feedback, ASML's machines could not mature. The partnership became a dialogue across continents. Engineers from Eindhoven and Hsinchu exchanged data daily, running parallel experiments on wavelength, resist chemistry, and vibration damping. Together they advanced from deep ultraviolet to extreme ultraviolet lithography, a leap that required physics bordering on alchemy, mirrors polished atomically smooth, light sources hotter than the surface of the sun, and alignment tolerances measured in picometers. Other companies hesitated. Chang committed. He poured billions into ASML's prototypes, years before anyone could guarantee that the machines would work. It was an act of faith in process, not prediction. When competitors delayed, waiting for certainty, TSMC built pilot lines and learned by failure. In return, ASML treated TSMC as a co-developer rather than a customer. The collaboration preserved Moore's law for another generation and bound Europe's most advanced physics lab to Asia's most disciplined factory. It was an alliance of temperament. Both cultures believed that perfection was not invention, but endurance. Around the same time, Apple entered the picture. In 2011, the company was designing its own processors, the A-series chips that would define the iPhone and iPad, and needed a partner capable of turning radical designs into flawless silicon at industrial scale. Samsung had manufactured the early versions but was now both supplier and rival. Apple turned to TSMC. Negotiations were quiet, contracts labyrinthine, the standards absolute. The chip had to be smaller, faster, and more power efficient than any in history. Failure would be measured not in dollars, but in headlines. Chang understood the stakes. He assigned his most meticulous teams to the project and instituted a new level of secrecy. The fabs handling Apple's wafers became self-contained worlds, sealed even from other divisions. Technicians referred to them by code numbers rather than clients. The work was punishing. Thousands of process steps, each with dozens of sub-variables, each capable of ruin. But the result was transcendence in miniature. The A-series processors achieved yields once thought impossible, powering devices that sold in the hundreds of millions. For the first time, consumers held in their hands a product whose soul had been forged in Hsinchu. If Apple brought TSMC mass, NVIDIA brought it destiny. Jensen Huang, another Taiwanese-born engineer who had built his career in the United States, visited TSMC's fabs in the late 1990s. His company was designing graphics processing units, GPUs, that turned mathematical parallelism into imagery. What began as chips for video games soon evolved into engines for computation itself. To achieve the necessary performance, Huang needed manufacturing precision that no Western foundry could guarantee. TSMC accepted the challenge. The collaboration between the two men, Huang the architect, Chang the builder, became one of the defining partnerships of the modern era. Each new GPU generation pushed the limits of physics. Transistor counts doubled, power densities rose, defect tolerances shrank. Chang's engineers met every escalation with new process nodes, 130 nanometers, 90, 65, 40. They built not only chips, but the infrastructure of machine learning. When, in the following decade, neural network researchers discovered that GPUs could simulate the structure of thought, TSMC's wafers became the substrate of that revelation. Artificial intelligence in its physical form was an artifact of their cooperation. The scale of what TSMC was building defied ordinary measurement. Each wafer passed through more than 1,000 steps: deposition, ion implantation, etching, chemical mechanical polishing, over weeks of continuous motion. The fabs operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under air so clean that a particle of dust would be a crisis. A single machine cost as much as a passenger jet. A single miscalibration could destroy millions in minutes. Yet the defect rates continued to fall. Chang's principle, measure everything, believe nothing you cannot repeat, had become architecture. In public, he spoke sparingly, preferring to let data and dividends speak. In private, he was relentless about standards. He reminded managers that reliability was not a goal, but a behavior. Every morning's yield chart was a mirror of conscience. Every deviation required explanation. When asked by journalists how he motivated 30,000 employees, he replied, "By truth. Machines do not respond to enthusiasm." By the early 2000s, TSMC had become a geopolitical fact. The world's dependence on its output was so complete that its continued operation was a matter of international security. Taiwan's economy derived 1/3 of its exports from semiconductors. Its allies derived their technologies from TSMC's lines. The phrase Silicon Shield entered policy papers, the notion that the island's fabs were its deterrent, making war unthinkable because their destruction would cripple global supply chains. Chang dismissed the metaphor as melodrama, yet he understood the reality behind it. Precision had become diplomacy. He retired in 2005, officially at least. His successor, Rick Tsai, was a competent executive, but the company soon stumbled. Yields dipped, schedules slipped, morale wavered, investors fretted. Within 2 years, Chang returned as chairman and CEO, his calm restored like gravity. He spent the next decade rebuilding confidence, reinforcing process discipline, and mentoring the next generation of leadership. When he retired again in 2018, handing the reins to C.C. Wei, he left behind a machine that could outlast its maker. "A good system," he said in his farewell address, "is one that no longer needs me." The world that TSMC now supplied was not the one he had entered half a century earlier. Globalization had turned interdependence into vulnerability. The United States worried about supply concentration. China, racing to build its own semiconductor capability, saw Taiwan's fabs as both aspiration and obstacle. Trade wars erupted, sanctions tightened, and suddenly the factory that had represented neutrality found itself at the center of a technological Cold War. Chang, now in his late 80s, watched from retirement with the stoic patience of an engineer who had long known that every system contains its own instability. "Everything degrades," he said in an interview. "The task is to slow it down." Yet even amid geopolitical tension, TSMC continued to expand. New fabs rose in Taichung, Tainan, and Kaohsiung. Others were planned for Arizona and Japan. Each generation of process nodes, 10 nanometers, 7, 5, 3, required reinvention. The transition to extreme ultraviolet lithography, powered by ASML's monstrous machines, pushed human precision to the edge of reason. A single EUV tool contained hundreds of thousands of parts, aligned with tolerances smaller than atoms. Only TSMC and a handful of competitors years behind could make them sing. The partnership between the Dutch and the Taiwanese had become the most complex supply relationship in history, an unbroken chain of optics, chemistry, and trust stretching halfway around the world. Within those limits, Chang saw poetry. To him, each new node was not conquest, but refinement, the human desire to understand reality more exactly. "Every reduction in size," he once told a visiting reporter, "is an increase in truth." He liked to point out that the word precision comes from the Latin precidere, to cut shorter. Shrinking transistors was the literal pursuit of definition. By the 2000s, the company's fabs were producing chips that powered nearly every advanced device on the planet. Smartphones, laptops, cars, satellites, all traced their lineage to TSMC's process libraries. The company employed over 70,000 people and commanded more than half of the global foundry market. Yet Chang never allowed it to cultivate grandeur. The company's annual meetings remained understated affairs, its public relations minimal. He considered visibility a distraction. "Our influence," he said, "is large enough without decoration." He watched his successors with pride but no envy. The culture he had built, measurement over speculation, humility over spectacle, endured. Even the younger engineers who had never met him referred to Chang's law, the belief that yield reveals character. They invoked it half jokingly, half reverently whenever a process improvement succeeded. It was their private catechism. Outside the clean rooms, Taiwan had changed almost beyond recognition. Skyscrapers rose in Taipei. High-speed trains stitched the island together. Democratic politics thrived with the noisy confidence of maturity. The society that had once feared its fragility now flaunted its competence. Its best export was not labor, but order. Chang, ever modest, denied that TSMC had shaped the nation's psyche, but the resemblance was hard to ignore. Both had been built on discipline learned through crisis. Both had turned vulnerability into precision. The company's engineers joked that their founder was the island's true philosopher. He preferred not to answer, though in interviews he sometimes hinted at a worldview that blended engineering and ethics. "We live by iteration," he said once. "You try, you fail, you measure, you correct. That is science, and it is also life to him." Technology was not progress, but an ongoing act of correction, a way for humanity to stay in conversation with its own imperfections. In the middle of the 2010s, a new hunger arrived, one that made even smartphones look quaint. The world wanted intelligence itself in silicon. Neural networks, once academic curiosities, suddenly required billions of calculations per second, multiplied by data centers that filled the night with light. The hardware for that future did not yet exist. It would have to be imagined by Jensen Huang's engineers at NVIDIA and manufactured with impossible accuracy in Chang's fabs. The GPUs that trained the first large-scale machine learning models were born in Hsinchu. Each chip contained tens of billions of transistors, each aligned within nanometers. A single defect could unbalance the arithmetic of an entire network. The machines that wrote them were so complex that no single person understood all their parts. What emerged from this collaboration, NVIDIA's design, ASML's optics, TSMC's process, was a global act of synchronized precision. Artificial intelligence was not a spontaneous creation of code. It was a construction project that spanned continents. When ChatGPT, Midjourney, and their cousins appeared a few years later, their computational souls rested on wafers born in Taiwan's clean rooms. The irony did not escape Chang. He had built his life around measurement, and now the machines his company produced were learning to measure thought itself. "We gave them the medium," he told an interviewer, "but what they say is up to them." He meant it as an engineer, not a prophet, but the remark captured the unease of the moment. The world was discovering that the intelligence it was birthing depended on the narrowest bottleneck in industrial history, a handful of factories on an island within sight of the Chinese coast. Geopolitics returned with a vengeance. Beijing declared semiconductor self-sufficiency a matter of national survival. Washington answered with export controls and subsidies. The CHIPS Act of 2022 promised tens of billions to rebuild domestic fabrication, while Japan, South Korea, and Europe drafted their own plans. Yet even as the money flowed, everyone knew that replication would take decades. The ecosystem that surrounded TSMC, its suppliers of gases, chemicals, wafers, optics, and software, was not a network, but an organism, evolved through 30 years of iteration. It could not be cloned by decree. Chang, by then long retired, watched the new rivalry with a blend of fascination and restraint. He had always treated politics as another variable, important, unpredictable, measurable only in the long run, but he understood its danger. Precision, he said, cannot survive ideology. He feared that the new technological nationalism would encourage shortcuts, subsidies chasing symbols instead of yield. He spent his final years as public elder rather than executive. His speeches were rare, his tone undramatic. At conferences, he spoke not of disruption, but of continuity. Progress, he told a group of young engineers, is repetition with memory. They applauded politely, perhaps not realizing how much of their world had been built on that sentence. The audience came expecting a legend. They found instead a craftsman explaining that greatness was just correctness repeated long enough. In Hsinchu, the company he founded continued its ritual pace. C.C. Wei's leadership carried the same quiet intensity. The fabs expanded across the island, reaching south to Tainan and north toward Taipei. Each new plant cost tens of billions of dollars and contained more computing power than the entire planet had possessed when Chang began. ASML's EUV machines arrived under armed escort, each one a small cathedral of optics and plasma. Inside them, light shorter than thought carved pathways a few dozen atoms wide, translating human imagination into matter. Outside, the world grew more brittle. Pandemics exposed supply chain fragility, droughts threatened water supplies for fabrication, power grids strained under demand. Each crisis reminded policymakers how much of modern life depended on invisible precision. The chips in ventilators, in laptops, in cars, all traced back to the same coordinates on the map. When earthquakes rattled Taiwan, global markets held their breath. When tensions flared across the strait, diplomats spoke of deterrence in terms of nanometers. The silicon shield was no longer metaphor, but arithmetic. Too many lives, economies, and armies depended on TSMC's continuity for anyone to risk breaking it. Chang disliked the heroism imposed on him. "We are not soldiers," he said. "We are engineers." Yet he admitted the symmetry. The discipline that had protected his fabs was now protecting his country. Taiwan's democracy, once tentative, had matured under the same ethic of accountability that governed its factories. Mistakes were counted, corrected, learned from. The island's culture of competence had become its defense strategy. He traveled less in those years, preferring the predictability of home. Reporters who visited him found a man still precise in dress, still analytic in conversation. His office shelves held more history than technology. volumes on Chinese poetry, American industry, and European philosophy. He spent hours reading, marking passages about order and decay. When asked how he felt seeing the world depend on his creation, he shrugged. Dependence, he said, is always temporary. Systems evolve. Friends noticed that he spoke more often of ethics than of engineering. He described TSMC not as a company but as a moral system, one that rewarded honesty because the physics of fabrication punished deceit. If you lie to a process, he said, it will fail. That's why I prefer machines to people. They always tell you the truth. It was a line half in jest, half in reverence. For him, truth had always been empirical. He accepted honors reluctantly, the IEEE Medal of Honor, the founding of the Morris Chang Chair at Stanford, the national decorations from Taiwan's presidents. Ceremonies made him restless. The only award he seemed to cherish was the internal chart showing TSMC's yield over time, a smooth curve approaching asymptote, the visual proof that discipline could approximate perfection. In public memory, he became the archetype of the modern sage, the refugee who built the world's most advanced machines and asked for nothing but accuracy in return. He resisted myth, but history made one of him anyway. When journalists compared him to Rockefeller or Edison, he corrected them gently. I am a bridge, he said, between science and work. It was the truest description of his vocation. Not inventor, not financier, but translator between idea and execution. The final years of his life coincided with the dawn of what commentators called the age of synthetic minds. The large language models that began to write, reason, and compose did so on GPUs designed by NVIDIA and manufactured by TSMC. Artificial intelligence, in a material sense, ran on his principles. The ethics of yield had become the ethics of cognition. Each misprediction in a neural network mirrored a defect on a wafer, an imperfection to be recorded, corrected, learned from. Humanity had extended his method into thought itself. Chang rarely commented on this convergence, but when he did, his observations were disarming. The machines we make are faster than us, he said, but they still rely on our honesty. He meant that progress remained a moral endeavor. The precision of silicon could not redeem the inaccuracy of motive. Civilization would continue to depend on engineers who measured not only voltages, but consequences. He lived long enough to see Taiwan's landscape transformed by the industry he had midwifed. From the air at night, the island looked like a string of constellations along its western coast, the lights of fabs and offices forming a single luminous vein. Each point of brightness represented a node in the global nervous system, chips in aircraft, data centers, prosthetic limbs, and satellites. The glow was beautiful and faintly terrifying, a reminder that the human desire for order could now be seen from space. On quiet evenings, he walked the paths near his home in Hsinchu, hearing the distant hum of cooling towers. He said it comforted him. It was the sound of continuity, the world's heart beating in nanoseconds. Sometimes he stopped to watch the glow on the horizon, neither proud nor sentimental, simply aware. A life that had begun amid the collapse of empires had ended in the steady rhythm of precision. The bridges of Chongqing had become circuits of silicon. The boy who once counted bombs now counted transistors. In one of his last interviews, he was asked what he considered his legacy. He paused a long moment before answering. Yield, he said finally, not just in factories, in people. How much of what we attempt becomes real? It was the definition of an engineer and perhaps of civilization itself. At night, from orbit, the island of Taiwan gleams like a metronome of light between the darkness of oceans. Its glow is not the blaze of conquest, but the whisper of process, the collective hum of machines translating photons into logic. In that light is the memory of a refugee child rebuilding bridges, the patience of a man who taught the world that truth could be manufactured, and the quiet faith that precision, properly understood, is another name for peace.